Welcome to Height Doesn't Measure Worth, where we dive into the lives, stories, and perspectives of people who stand a little closer to the ground, but whose spirit stands tall. I'm your host, Wamuzi, and today we're going to talk about what it means to be short. Now, being short is something a lot of people have opinions on, whether they're good, bad, or somewhere in between. But guess what? It's not just a physical trait, it's an experience, a journey, and sometimes even a superpower. We'll be talking about how height has been perceived throughout history, in pop culture, and even dive into some science. Plus, we've got a few real-life stories to share. So buckle up, or if you're short like me, grab a step stool, and let's get into it. And hey, if you've got any short friends, tell them to listen in. It's about time we celebrate the fun-sized among us. All right, so let's start by talking about how society has historically viewed height. Spoiler alert, being short wasn't always seen as a disadvantage. In fact, in ancient times, height didn't hold the same significance as it does today. Take Napoleon Bonaparte, for example. You've probably heard of the Napoleon complex, which is supposed to describe short people who overcompensate with aggressive behavior. But guess what? Napoleon wasn't even that short. He was actually around 5'6", which was average for a Frenchman of his time. The whole Napoleon was short thing was just propaganda used by the British to make him look weak. But let's go further back. Think about ancient Egypt. Height wasn't the determining factor of power or success. The pharaohs were often depicted as larger-than-life figures, but that was more symbolic of their status rather than their actual height. Even in ancient Greece, while physical prowess was valued, many of their greatest philosophers were not towering figures. Aristotle, for instance, wasn't exactly a giant, but he was a giant in his intellect. Throughout history, there have been plenty of influential people who didn't tower over others. Take Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. He was only 5'2". Then there's Pablo Picasso, standing at just 5'4", who completely revolutionized the art world. And of course, let's not forget Mahatma Gandhi, a leader of an entire nation who was around 5'4" too. So you see, height may have gotten more attention in modern times, but historically, it wasn't something that held people back. And when you really think about it, the accomplishments of these individuals show that greatness isn't measured in inches. Let's fast forward to modern times, where short people continue to make their mark, especially in pop culture. Look at Hollywood. Kevin Hart, one of the funniest guys in the world, is just 5'4", and he jokes about his height all the time. It's part of his charm, and he's turned it into a huge asset in his comedy. Then there's Danny DeVito, iconic in roles like in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia or Batman Returns. Standing at 4'10", he's proof that big things can come in small packages. And speaking of musicians, Lady Gaga, who stands at about 5'1", has shattered records, turned heads, and created music that has changed pop culture forever. You can't talk about short legends without mentioning her. But it's not always easy. Short actors and actresses are often cast in sidekick roles or comedic parts because for some reason, Hollywood still tends to equate height with heroism. And don't get me started on the romantic leads. How many short guys or girls do you see getting the main love story in movies? Not enough. Let's not forget the song Short People by Randy Newman. While it's meant to be tongue-in-cheek, it stirred up a lot of controversy when it was released. People thought it was making fun of short people, but the truth is, it was poking fun at society's obsession with height. But despite the jokes and stereotypes, short people in pop culture are proving that size really doesn't matter when it comes to talent and success. All right, time to put on our science hats. Let's talk about the biology and psychology behind being short. First off, height is largely determined by genetics. About 80% of your height is inherited, and the other 20% is influenced by nutrition, environment, and other factors. So if you're short, you can blame your parents, but only partially. What's really interesting is how height affects the way people view themselves and how others view them. Studies have shown that taller people are often perceived as more authoritative or competent, which is why you'll see a lot of tall people in leadership roles. But shorter people often have to work harder to prove themselves, and that's not a bad thing. It can build resilience, confidence, and determination. And here's a fun fact. Some studies suggest that shorter people may actually live longer. There's research that links shorter height with lower risks of certain diseases and greater longevity. So while we may not reach the top shelf without help, we're in it for the long haul. And when it comes to health, there's actually less strain on the body when you're shorter. So, being closer to the ground might not just be good for your perspective, it might be good for your health too. Now, it's time to share some real-life stories from people who know what it's like to live life a little lower to the ground. Our first story comes from Sarah, who's 50. She says, "Being short can be frustrating sometimes, especially when you're trying to reach something on the top shelf at the grocery store. But I always remind myself that it also makes me approachable. People always ask me for directions or help, and I love that it gives me an opportunity to connect with others." Then there's Mark, who's 5'5". He says, "Growing up, I was always the shortest guy in my class. I got teased a lot, but I learned to laugh at myself. Now, I'm a stand-up comedian, and I make jokes about my height on stage all the time. It's become part of my identity, and I love it." And last, we have a story from Jenny, who's 4'11". She says, "People always assume I'm younger than I am because of my height, and I used to hate that, but now I see it as a compliment. I'm 30, but people think I'm in my early 20s. I'm owning my youthful looks." Let's talk about stereotypes. One of the most common ones is the so-called Napoleon complex, the idea that short people are more aggressive because they feel insecure about their height. But honestly, that's a pretty outdated idea. There are short people who are calm and peaceful, just like there are tall people who are aggressive. Another stereotype is that short people are always funny or the comic relief. It's true that many short comedians have embraced their height as part of their act, but it's important to remember that not every short person is here to be a punchline. And dating, oh boy. It's no secret that height is often a factor in attraction, but I'm here to tell you that love doesn't care about inches. What really matters is who you are, not how tall you are. And trust me, short people make great partners. As we wrap up today's episode, I hope you've learned something new and maybe even found a new appreciation for the short people in your life. Or for yourself, if you're one of the fun-sized crowd like me. Height doesn't define who we are. It's just one small part of the bigger picture. Remember, what really matters is the size of your heart, your ambition, and your character. So stand tall, no matter how short you may be. Thank you for joining me today on Height Doesn't Measure Worth. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share with your friends, and leave a review. I'm your host Wamuzi, and I'll see you next time. Until then, keep reaching for the stars. No ladder required.